Okay, let's dive into what I think is a truly fascinating linguistic investigation. Today, our explainer is going to focus entirely on a single ancient Arabic word that sits squarely at the center of some massive modern political debates. That word is hukm, and it actually appears over 250 times in the Qur'an. And as we're about to see, how we understand this one single term has absolutely profound implications for history, law, and even modern governance.
I mean, it sounds completely astonishing, right? But can a single word really redefine a government? We're going to see exactly how the translation of just this one word dictates entirely different views on how a state should be structured. Because depending on how you interpret hukm, you might advocate for a purely secular, modern civil state, or on the flip side, you might argue for a traditional Islamic governing structure. So this isn't just some abstract academic debate, it's a foundational question about the very nature of authority itself.
So, to break this all down impartially, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the debate over one word. Second, the surprising linguistic roots. Third, judging versus ruling. Fourth, prophets in ancient kings. And finally, decoding the Quranic context.
Let's jump right into part one, the debate over one word. Now, let's start by looking at the modernist argument, articulated by thinkers like Abdullah Belkizis. This perspective claims that the word hukm strictly means judicial adjudication, basically resolving disputes in a court of law. According to this specific view, when classical texts talk about hukm, they are talking exclusively about judges. They argue it is completely separate from political or executive authority. So the crucial question really boils down to this. Does the ancient text refer to the sweeping power of overall governance, or is it merely referring to the limited scope of a courtroom? Modernists argue that applying the word hukm to executive political authority is actually a recent distortion. And if they're right, well, that completely rewrites how historical governance in the Islamic world is understood today. To find out if they are right, we have to dig into the language itself. Moving on to part two, the surprising linguistic roots. Language naturally evolves over time, so we have to ask, what did hukm actually mean to Arabs 1,400 years ago? Amazingly, the root of the word hukm actually comes from the physical bit of a horse. Classical scholars note this is literally the piece of metal in a horse's mouth that connects to the reins. It's what prevents the horse from just running aimlessly. And this etymology is incredibly revealing because it inherently carries these dual ideas of restraining corruption on one hand and providing clear direction on the other. And this is where it gets really cool, because it brilliantly illustrates how from that single concept of a horse's bit, an entire family of words was born. We have hikmah, meaning wisdom, hakim, meaning ruler, hakim, meaning judge, and hukuma, meaning government. So the linguistic DNA of hukm encompasses both those who judge and those who rule. They all share that core foundational meaning of guiding and preventing corruption. Which brings us to section 3, judging versus ruling. Now, if we look at early dictionaries, like the incredibly famous Lisan al-Arab from 1290 CE, they treat hukm and qadah, which means judging, as synonyms. And that's because they both involve issuing decrees. The reason they were used interchangeably is simply that both a judge and a ruler issue rules, right? But the reality of their actual power is where the divergence happens. Think about it like this. When we map out the actual functional distinctions, they're vastly different. A judge, representing the judicial branch, requires a claimant to bring a case forward, and crucially, they lack direct execution power. They just give the ruling. A ruler, on the other hand, the executive branch, can initiate laws without a claimant. They hold the actual power of execution via the military or police, commands general obedience, and wield authority everywhere in the state, not just inside a courtroom.
All right, section 4, prophets and ancient kings.
But wait, we really have to ask ourselves, did this clear-cut modern separation of powers even exist back in ancient Arabia? Historical records show us that projecting our modern separation of powers backward is a total anachronism. It just wasn't how the ancient world worked. Back in early tribal structures, elite leaders embodied both executive and judicial roles all at once. They judged the disputes and they executed the laws. It was a packaged deal. And this is exactly why ancient texts, like this well-known verse about Prophet Dawud, inextricably link the executive title of Khalifa with the act of hukm. Historical context tells us Dawud was a great king, an executive ruler, yet the text commands him to do hukm. He was both king and judge. Therefore, separating the two functions and claiming hukm only applies to courtroom judges
completely ignores the historical reality of how ancient leadership actually functioned. Finally, Section 5, decoding the Quranic context. So because these early leaders held complete, unified authority, classical commands regarding hukm apply to the entire apparatus of government. A judge is a ruler only in a highly limited juridical sense. So when classical texts command leaders to rule or perform hukm with justice, they are comprehensively addressing absolutely anyone holding the reins of state affairs. And that brings us to a really fundamental rule of Arabic linguistics. Because hukm is a mushtarak, which is a homonym, a word with multiple valid meanings, linguistic rules dictate that unless there is a specific contextual clue, known as a qarina, restricting it, it inherently carries both the meaning of judging and ruling simultaneously. So without a specific context narrowing it down to just a courtroom, the ancient textual use of hukm legally and linguistically applies to full executive and judicial authority. So, as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with this thought. Projecting our modern political structures onto ancient words can completely alter our understanding of history. If we just assume ancient Arabia had the exact same separation of powers we do today, we misread the text entirely. The mystery of hukm is a perfect reminder that to truly understand the past, we have to speak its language on its own terms. It really makes you wonder, what other foundational concepts might we be misunderstanding simply because we're viewing them through a purely modern lens? Definitely something to think about.